This is something I've witnessed myself in New Mexico. For a while I thought I might be insane or hallucinating, but now I know I'm not. I own a decent-sized ranch in the northwestern part of the state. I have a few hundred head of cattle and twice as many chickens. I'm one of the last true ranchers left in the area. I inherited the property from my father, and he inherited it from his, going all the way back to the early 1900s before New Mexico was even a state. Even way back then, there were stories of monsters and demons living in the desert. Everybody's heard of the chupacabra, but I never paid any of it any mind, thinking it was all a bunch of horse crap. Well, my opinion has changed. You see, about a month ago, some pretty nasty things started happening out in the area. A man that I was good friends with discovered 3 of his dogs torn to shreds at the edge of his property. Those dogs were tough mixed breeds. He used to take them elk hunting up north. Whatever killed those poor pups sure wasn't a coyote. I kept my own dog Cruiser close by my side after that. A few nights later, we had our own incident. It was late in the evening. The sun had just gone down. I was in Albuquerque all day and had gotten back late, but I still had a few things to take care of before going to sleep when I heard a commotion coming from the hen house. Sometimes a coyote came sniffing around and occasionally managed to finagle its way into the hen house, usually at the loss of 1 or 2 hens. But as I ran up to the building, I could hear an extreme disturbance coming from inside and the sounds of hundreds of chickens going berserk. As I threw open the door, I could tell something was seriously wrong. Every hen in the building, about 400 of them, were in an extreme state of panic. I heard the sound of wrenching metal coming from the far side of the building and ran to investigate. I was greeted with a scene of chaos. A huge gaping hole had been torn into the side of the house, like something sharp had just sheared through sheet metal, creating a 10-foot wide gap. Dozens of hens had been torn to pieces. Chicken wire, wood, and feathers were all there in a bloody, twisted mess. Raising and slaughtering animals for food is a part of what I do, and agree or disagree, it is a vital component of this country's way of life. But even my heart broke a little at the way these poor little girls had perished, wasteful and needless. Whatever had perpetrated this had done so for the pure sake of taking lives. We fixed up the damage as best we could, and I asked a few of my hands to stay in our guest house for a few days until whatever this was blew over. I wish that had been the end of it, but there was to be one last incident. A few nights afterwards, sometime in the middle of the night, I was woken by my wife shaking me violently. She said that Cruiser, who was sleeping at the foot of the bed, had jumped up snarling and took off out of the room and down the stairs. We had a doggy door for Cruiser. He was used to being his own dog, and he was outside right now barking up a storm at something out there in the darkness. Cruiser was a clever dog and well-trained. If he was alarmed, then it was for a good reason. More importantly, he was my closest and most loyal companion of these last 12 years, and I'd be damned if he was going to face whatever was out there alone. Hardly stopping to think, I grabbed my 12 gauge from beside my bed and, like a fool, ran out into the New Mexico night with no shoes, no light, and no idea what I was going up against. Before I had made it outside, Cruiser's barking had stopped short. I ran out onto the front porch and couldn't see him anywhere. The immediate area was illuminated by lights from the house, but beyond that was complete darkness. I ran to the perimeter of the light, yelling Cruiser repeatedly in a near state of panic. Suddenly, I heard his barking again, this time way out in the darkness. I took off, heading straight for the barking, gravel and stones cutting into the bare skin of my feet. When I got to the spot where I had thought I heard Cruiser, I heard his barking again, coming from a different direction. I ran towards it, but before I could reach him again, the noise changed directions. Another 2 or 3 times this happened, each time taking me further and further from the fading lights of the house. I sat panting in the darkness. I knew that something was very wrong. Cruiser hadn't barked in several minutes, and I wasn't completely sure which direction led back to the house. As I was trying to catch my breath and consider my options, I heard something slinking around just outside my field of vision. Then, the absolute most terrifying moment of my entire life occurred. From right behind me, not 10 feet away, came a human scream. It was my voice, me, screaming "Cruiser," exactly as I had been doing for the last 10 minutes. I turned, raising my shotgun to fire. In the instant before pulling the trigger, I could make out a black shape at least 10 feet high. The area around seemed brighter in comparison, as if it pulled the darkness into itself. I fired, and in the brief muzzle flash, I saw something shooting straight for my head. I felt an impact, and then nothing at all. One of my field hands found me, laying out there in the dark, about a quarter mile away from the house. It was a feat of luck that he did, for even a group of 6 men could have easily passed me by in the dark. I was still out of it, and they carried me back to the house and laid me down. The next day I woke up to a bad gash on my head, and even worse news. My man who had found me told me that my wife had called them when I ran out into the night. When they came looking for me, they heard my shotgun blast and followed the noise. He said there was nothing in the area where they found me, except a pool of thick black liquid leading to a spatter trail going off into the desert. They also found Cruiser huddled under a bush, not too far away from my house, completely on the opposite side of where I had been looking. They could barely get him out from under there, and he's still not 100% relaxed again yet. By the grace of God, nothing else has happened since, though. It's only been 2 weeks. I've asked 2 of my hands to move onto the property permanently and contracted a security company to install a dozen-plus security cameras around the ranch. I can confirm that there is something deadly out in the New Mexican desert. Call it a chupacabra or a demon or whatever. I don't care. All I know is that it's not just an animal hunting for food, it's evil. It toys with its prey and kills for sport. Just be careful out there. I was a county sheriff for a small town in Ohio when this happened. In total, I was there for a couple of years before finding another position closer to my parents' house. They were getting older, and I wanted to be closer to home. At least that's what I told everyone when I moved away. The reality of it was, I was moving because of an experience I had on the job in May of 2008. I was called to a home regarding a complaint about some neighborhood kids. I didn't know the details, but I wasn't worried. This type of thing happens all the time, especially in smaller towns where kids don't have that much to do. Sometimes there is property damage that we need to report, but for the most part, it's just harmless pranks. I had a name, an address, and a message about crazy, evil demon children, but that was it. A woman answered the door when I arrived at the house. I would guess her to be in her mid-60s. She was a nice lady, seemed normal enough at our first interaction, but she was terrified to go outside. She asked me to remove my sunglasses before she let me through the door. I didn't understand why until later. She told me 3 kids came to her door last night, all dressed up in old clothes like they were Amish or something. She said they pounded on her front door and claimed they needed help. Their story was that they were lost and needed to use her phone. Of course, she opened the door, but the kids all just stood there with their eyes down, staring at their feet. They repeated their plea, that they were lost and needed to use the phone. She asked the kids where they were from, but they wouldn't say. They just kept repeating that they were lost and needed the phone. And then they asked if they could come in. The woman told me it was then that she knew something was wrong. She didn't say how she knew, but she knew she couldn't let them in. She said she offered to bring her phone out to the porch for them to use, but then they said they were cold, and could they please come inside? The woman said no, and when she went to close the door, all 3 kids looked up at her. She claimed that it was at that point that she realized they all had black eyes. Not just black irises, but the whole eye was completely black. She slammed her front door and locked it, but she said as soon as she turned the lock on the door, there was instantly pounding on the back door. She looked across the house, and there were the kids knocking at the back door. She said there was no way they could have gotten there so fast, when just a moment ago, they were all at the front of the house. She ran to the back door and locked it before they could get in. She then went around to every window in the house, locking them and pulling the shades. She then said that she ended up locking herself in her bedroom all night. She said there was periodic knocking at her doors and windows all throughout the night, but she was too terrified to get up and look. I took her story down exactly as she told it, regardless of how ridiculous it sounded. She was convinced the kids were some evil creatures from hell, but I reassured her that it was most likely a very elaborate prank. It wouldn't be too hard for a few kids to go to a costume shop and pick up some outfits and black contacts for a prank night. I advised her to look into getting a home security system and some cameras so she could have some peace of mind in her home. There wasn't much else I could do. I didn't think much about the creepy kids until later that night when I stopped at a gas station to pick up a bottle of water and a couple of snacks. The gas station was pretty quiet, but that wasn't unusual for that part of town. As I got back to my car and closed the door, there was a knock at my window. It was a child, maybe 9 or 10 years old at the most, dressed in what looked like old Victorian-era clothes. I thought, great, I've got a lead on these pranksters. But when I rolled down my window, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The kid said he was lost and asked if he could get in my car. My heart jumped into my throat as if my body sensed something evil. I didn't know what this thing was, this so-called child, but I knew it wasn't human. I asked the kid for his name and where he lived, but he just kept repeating that he was lost and asking to come into the car. It was almost like he didn't know how to say anything else. I told him he couldn't come in, but I could call his parents for him. Then the kid looked up at me with eyes black as night, and without changing the look on his face, he turned and took off into the forest on the other side of the road. Once he reached the trees, he seemingly disappeared into thin air. I didn't try to follow him. I just knew that wouldn't end well, and I didn't want to find out exactly what that would be. Like a lot of people who work as park rangers, I love the outdoors. I don't want to be under a roof. I want to be out hiking, trail clearing, whatever. I work at Henry W. Coe State Park, an 87,000-acre reserve in Northern California. It's a big place full of relatively unspoiled wilderness and gorgeous scenery. We have fishing, hunting, and even equestrian campgrounds if you want to bring your horse. The park is what you'd call rugged. In fact, some of the more adventurous hiking loops are steep enough that you need to be in great shape to make it all the way through. Naturally, maintaining the trails is important, and checking trail conditions can take a long time. Typically, we do our routine patrols alone, but there are times and places where we go in pairs. Since I've been on the job for a while, I usually have one of the more junior park rangers with me. It's nice because I like showing them some of the spots only a longtime ranger knows. We don't talk about it much, but there are a few places in Henry Coe Park that, well, they have a history. Actually, a lot of the park has a history, but it's not generally known. But this one is, the park staff calls it Hangman's Hill. It's not just a scenic overlook with an interesting name. That title was earned because the tree at the top was used to execute more than one outlaw during California's Wild West days. Since Hangman's Hill is a popular hiking destination, the trail and area see more use than most. We regularly patrol and check the trail conditions to make sure they're as safe as possible. I was out on patrol with Oliver, one of the newest park rangers. We were hiking the long loop up to Hangman's Hill. It starts out easy, but the middle section gets steep and rough, and even the best hikers need to take breaks. We did a little trail maintenance along the way, picking up trash and cleaning up. It always amazes me that people can't leave the wilderness the way they found it. There were a few places where there were deeper ruts in the dirt, like something had been digging in the trail, but we filled those in. The day was perfect for hiking. Clear blue sky, annoyingly bright sunshine, and the weather was a crisp 73 degrees. Oliver and I made good time as we progressed up the trail. We passed a few hikers, but apparently Hangman's Hill wasn't popular that day. That was fine by me. We'd been getting some complaints about downed tree limbs up there, and the last thing I wanted to do was deal with the public while I was trying to hack up a giant branch. At the halfway point, when the trail gets steep enough that you're climbing rather than hiking, We took a breather, and I casually asked Oliver whether he'd been up this trail before. He hadn't. This is always the awkward part of breaking in a new park ranger, because it can go one of two ways. I can warn them nothing happens, and they think I'm being a jerk and complain to our supervisor, or they don't believe me, and if something does happen, I have to deal with a terrified coworker who complains to our supervisor. I asked Oliver if he's been up to Hangman's Hill before. He hasn't even heard of it. Well, this is going to be fun. I casually mentioned that the site has a lot of history behind it. Desperados, horse rustlers, claimed jumpers, and classic Wild West justice. There was even an infamous pair of brothers who were hanged up there. I don't lay it on too thick. I just tell it like a historical lecture, and I can tell Oliver is taking it like classroom information. I don't think that'll last long, but I guess it depends on the hill. The hike up to the crest of Hangman's Hill is another hour, and the minute we get up to the site, I can tell it's going to be a rough visit. The bright sun that's been making me squint, even though I'm wearing sunglasses and my uniform hat is strangely cool and dim. There's a breeze moving through the pines at the perimeter of the hill. The perimeter, not the hilltop itself. The hanging tree is the only thing at the top, and it stands at the center of the hill. Nothing but grass grows around it. No flowers, no scrub. Just weedy grass that's too tough to care about what else is up there. The tree itself is completely bare. Bark beetles got to it decades ago, and a burned-out hollow at the base shows that it's been struck by lightning at least once. Most of the tree limbs are long gone, except one. The one branch that still exists is thick and juts out far to the right. It's about 12 feet off the ground, perfect height for the hangman's noose. Going up to Hangman's Hill is never a good time, but there's a job to do. I point out the deadfall and broken branches from the last windstorm, and Oliver and I get to work. I give him credit for keeping his cool, but I also wonder how long it will take before he notices that, aside from the strangely loud sound of our saws, there's no sound at the top of the hill. No birds singing, nothing. The fact that I can feel a breeze but not hear it, it's bad sign number 2. We finish cutting the deadfall into manageable logs and stack them off to the side, and that's when Oliver really looks at the hanging tree. He asked me why we don't cut that one down. It's dead. I'm all set to give him the "it's a historical marker" talk when the wind shifts, blowing right past the tree. I smell the unmistakable stink of rot and decay, even though there isn't anything dead that I can see. All of a sudden, I feel a blast of wind rush up the hilltop, and there's sound again. Men swearing, the deep grunts and neighing of horses. The crack of a gunshot bounces all around us, and both of us hit the ground out of reflex. Oliver's looking around for the shooter. I'm looking at the tree. There's something on it. Or, well, 2 somethings. 2 black, ragged shapes, heads tilted at unnatural angles, twisting in the wind as they dangle from thick black ropes slung over that single long branch. The wind shifts to bring the stink of whiskey and body odor right into our faces. There's a huge, horrible feeling of pressure, like we're in the eye of a storm, and the sunlight goes so pale it might as well not be there. I manage to tell Oliver that we're done. Time to head out. I dig into my pack for the emergency bottle of whiskey I carry when I have to come up here and roll it toward the hanging tree. Oliver and I slide back over the edge of the hill and scramble down the slope. We haven't talked for a long time. When we got back to the ranger station, I opened my desk drawer for another bottle of whiskey and I offered him some. He shakes his head. When I came in the next day, I heard that Oliver put in for a transfer to another park. Me? Well, I'm still here. After all, somebody's got to keep Hangman's Hill's ghosts supplied with whiskey. When I joined the Air Force, I was given the opportunity to train as a mechanic. I enjoyed working on aircraft, but as with most jobs, there were secondary duties which weren't the most fun. For us, one of those chores was looking after the tool supplies. Usually we had a permanent civilian who ran tool supplies during the day, but someone had to be in there to run it during the night shift. The tool supplies building was in the middle of the airfield and pretty far away from the other hangars. It was at enough of a distance to feel pretty isolated. As a new enlistee, I was told that the tool supplies building on our squadron was haunted. I thought it was the usual crap that people would tell the new person, so I discounted it. I had done my fair share of tool duty when I was brand new. You don't really have much value until you're trained up, so they put you in the supply division. I had never had any issues, though. But about 6 months into my posting at this particular squadron, I found myself there again. We were night flying on the evening in question. That meant hardly anybody needed tools, so it definitely wasn't busy. I hadn't seen anyone in over an hour. It was getting on to about midnight, and usually we were trying to lock up by 1:30. But when we were night flying, the aircraft didn't land until around midnight, so we had to stay open longer in case they returned with something in disrepair. I was really tired and trying to keep my eyes open when I started hearing the sound of metal creaking. It was an old building with a ground floor and a first floor. The first floor was basically just metal staging, and you could see down to the ground from the first floor over a balcony-like structure. Although there were 2 floors, you could see pretty well upstairs from the ground and vice versa. The sound of metal creaking wasn't that unusual. The temperature was dropping, so it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But not seeing or talking to anyone for a while just seemed to make it a lot more noticeable. Half an hour passed, and I heard what sounded like metal dropping onto metal. There were lots of metal shelves, however the floor was rubber-studded. Anything that dropped off the shelf wouldn't have made much noise unless it was big, in which case there would be a dull thud. This was a distinct metal-on-metal sound. It was annoying me because I was in the office watching TV, and it was clearly audible above that, so it wasn't quiet. I decided to take a walk around and make sure nothing had fallen. Tool control was quite important, and if any tools were missing at the end of the night, everything would grind to a halt, and we'd have to search high and low until it was found. Nobody would be going home if we lost something. I decided it would be better to find something on the floor now than to wait until later and realize something wasn't where it should be. I walked around slowly, checking every tool, making sure everything that wasn't there was tagged out correctly or had paperwork stating where it was. I saw nothing out of place. I had a look upstairs, although I knew the noise hadn't come from up there. But nothing seemed to be out of place. At that point, I found myself slightly on edge. The thought had played on my mind that it might have been some of the other guys winding me up. Usually, we told the tool supplies ghost story to new people, and then when they found themselves on duty, it was fun to mess with them and silently come in through a little hatch in the back of the building. New people didn't know it was there, so you could get in undetected and get them spooked. I had been in the squadron for a while, and by this point, I was often the one playing the jokes. It didn't make much sense for anyone to be playing tricks on me. I took a seat back in the office and continued watching crappy midnight TV, just praying the jets would all come down in good shape so I could get out of there. No more than 5 minutes later, I started hearing footsteps. Finally, someone actually needs something, I thought. I went out to see what they wanted, but no one was there. I checked outside the front door in case they were bringing something back and needed help unloading it from the van, but there was nobody there. I thought I was losing it by then. I was really tired. I turned around to head back inside, and I saw wet footprints on the floor. It was wet outside, but my boots were dry since I hadn't been out all night. Nobody was in the tool supply area when I walked to the door, and nobody could have gotten past me to get inside while I was looking outside. While I stood there looking around, the footsteps started up again, and a whole shelf's worth of tools came clattering to the ground, as if an invisible hand had just swept across and pushed them over the edge. There was literally zero explanation for something like that happening. No wind, no earthquake, no movement of any sort. I just stood there staring at the pile, and I felt ice cold. I had never before believed in things being haunted or any kind of paranormal activity, but if something was trying to convince me that I should be, they sure did a good job. It doesn't seem like a huge thing, but it really freaked me out. After that night, I always did whatever I could to get myself out of that duty.